This video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. Halloween is here, and what better way to celebrate the spooky season than to indulge in some of the finest horror movies out there. However, streaming services can be very hit and miss depending on where you live due to geographical restrictions that limit what you get out of your membership. But thankfully, ExpressVPN makes it incredibly easy to bypass this issue and unlock more bang for your buck. You see, without ExpressVPN, it's like paying a hefty entry fee to a theme park, but you're only allowed to ride the slow-moving carousel. It's not to say you won't have a tiny bit of fun, but there's no value when you're refused access to the roller coasters everyone has been talking about. For example, if I want to use Shudder to watch fantastic films like Them, Reanimator, The Dirties, and Boys from County Hell, which was made in my country but isn't accessible on the UK server, all I do is pull up ExpressVPN on my phone, computer, or tablet device, select a US location, refresh my page, and I have instant access to these previously unavailable films plus many more. Conversely, if you're in the US, by selecting a UK location, you'll be able to access an entirely new selection of horrors, like Pulse, Possessor, Splinter, and Dawn of the Dead, which is an impressively difficult film to find. For less than $7 a month, ExpressVPN lets you access thousands of new shows and movies on your favorite streaming services, and best of all, I've yet to experience any slowdown in connection due to the fast speeds ExpressVPN consistently provides. So go to expressvpn.com/Ryan and find out how you can get 3 months of ExpressVPN for free. Dario Argento's 1977 supernatural cult classic Suspiria is a hypnotic and tantalizing plunge into a sensory nightmare that can only be truly appreciated by watching it for yourself. Best known as that horror movie that's super red, Suspiria is the purest definition of a show don't tell mood piece that's carried on the strength of its overwhelmingly audacious music by progressive rock band Goblin and a fairy tale-esque visual style that's as deliriously dazzling as it is gloriously fucking gruesome. It tells a fairly minimalistic tale about an elite German dance academy, where an American student called Susie begins experiencing bizarre and alluring paranormal occurrences, while a barbaric killer seemingly stalks and murders those who grow weary of the dance academy's true ulterior motive. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say this. Suspiria is one of my all-time favorite horror movies, yet at the same time, I totally understand it's a very acquired taste that isn't going to be for everyone, especially if you're keen on plot, because it doesn't really have much of one. Now, before devoted fans tear me a new one, Suspiria is actually part of a loose trilogy that took 40 years to complete, called The Three Mothers, which also consisted of 1980's spiritual sequel Inferno and 2007's Mother of Tears. However, when it comes to traditional storytelling, it literally relies on one of the most offensively contrived exposition dumps to deliver answers to its compelling central mystery. I will address this slightly later in the video because I'm not dismissing the story entirely, but at some point throughout, if you feel like watching Suspiria for yourself, it is worth having that at the back of your mind because it is easy to feel somewhat underwhelmed if you're waiting for some grand reveal that never comes. It really is the perfect example of a film where if you don't like the first 10 minutes, it's not going to get any better for you, so you've been warned. Although, with that said, if you want something that delves deeper into its characters and story, you actually can't go wrong with its surprisingly ambitious 2018 remake by Luca Guadagnino that, while different in many respects, complements the original in its own unique and twisted way, even if I have my fair share of issues that I'll explain later. In fact, it's one of those rare cases where I can see people preferring the remake, so as we go along, make sure to leave your preference in the comments below because you'll find it makes for a very fascinating insight into how each of us perceive what it is we truly want from the horror genre. So I've always put off talking about Suspiria because, as I've said before, I'm always worried that I won't say anything that hasn't already been covered a million times before, so I'm going to try and make a conscious effort not to talk too much about things that speak for themselves. Reviewing Suspiria is kinda like how I struggle with my Lighthouse video, because besides the fact it's hard to find an original spin on exploring something analysed in deathly detail, it's a film that digs very personally into my stronger feelings towards film and horror, and honestly, there's a part of it that leaves me a little depressed the more I think about it. As such, this isn't going to be one of those specific in-depth looks at Suspiria itself. This is more about what it means to me and my broad relationship with film. In the context of today's culture of instantaneous walkthrough content that doesn't engage emotionally with the subject matter, I feel it's made people less inclined to seek alternative styles of storytelling outside what is popular in the moment. Now, let me be clear, I'm not trying to snobbishly dictate how any of you wish to enjoy fiction. Hell, I am very aware some people watch my videos because they're terrified of horror movies but are interested to know what they're about. That's actually quite exciting to me because I feel like I'm introducing you to something cool without spoiling the entire experience if you choose to watch it later down the line. However, every so often, I can't help but feel like we've kind of lost this rawness of just letting films be journeys that are so much more about the intensity of provocative sound and imagery, and just going with the flow of pure escapism, where you don't think about the stresses and anxieties of the real world. I like that just for a moment you are somewhere else. Even if it's scary, it's still peaceful, and Suspiria is a perfect reminder of that. Suspiria takes me back to the curiosity and wonder that defined early film, with the likes of the Lumiere brothers, Georges Méliès and Sergei Eisenstein, the latter of whom wrote critically on film's power to impact us emotionally and psychologically through sound and visuals, than merely a story we forget once the next popular thing comes along. Today, we're so spoiled and desensitized by non-stop, constant, vapid media that recapturing the magic and illusion that cinema brought many of us as kids is heartbreakingly lost. Yet with Suspiria, it takes it a step beyond and gets me thinking about how long it's been since I was last at the theatre or going to see my favourite comedian or music band live. There is something so palpable, reinvigorating, empowering, and emotionally gratifying about the surge of energy that live performances produce. And while for many the movie-going experience has the same effect, personally it rarely ever does that for me. Hell, when I try to think of a recent example of something that produces similar endorphins that I get from live performances or films like Suspiria, Bo Burnham's Inside or James Wan's Malignant come to mind. Yes, there is something cerebral to it, a meaning, a story you have to put together yourself, but what ultimately defines it is the pleasure of letting your feelings take over when absorbing the spectacle. So with this emphasis on spectacle in mind, I want to talk a bit about how Suspiria taps into a very different but somewhat relatable type of discomfort. The opening 10 minutes of Suspiria tells you everything you need to know without you having to think about it. The heavy rain, the brooding score, Susie's white costume distinctly out of place amongst the redness of the mise-en-scene to contrast her innocence against the menacing backdrop, nothing is made to feel right. It immediately confronts you with this impending and utterly chilling threat as Susie witnesses another student mysteriously running away from the academy, only for her and her friend to soon be murdered by a lump of muscle. I just love how Suspiria forgoes traditional tension in favour of just kicking you right in the teeth. Calling it unsubtle isn't really an issue. It's meant to be attractive and entice your curiosity, because that's exactly how Susie feels as she seemingly becomes drawn in by the dance academy as if under a magical spell. It pretty much asks you to surrender your ego at the door and embrace the unnatural. The more you give into its spell, the less you question it and allow your emotions to control your mind, the more you'll find yourself in the shoes of Susie as she does the very same. One way I would describe watching Suspiria is try to imagine yourself standing in an open field. You can go wherever you want, you have peace and quiet, breathing room from the stresses of life, nobody is telling you what to do. However, you can't help but let your fears and anxieties begin to take over as you start to think your space and freedom is just a little too good to be true, because we're so used to life's rambunctious, noisy and spontaneous ways that we're not accustomed to being separated from it. Suddenly, all this peace and quiet makes you feel exposed and vulnerable. Everyone can see you, now you're paranoid and your perception is warped into this intense isolation where you're scared to move, when in reality, you can leave whenever you want to. This is basically the emotional turbulence I feel Susie experiences. When she arrives in Germany, she's making her own choices. She's an independent, talented girl doing what she wants with her life in pursuing her passion, but what haunts her is this psychological intruder who manipulates her into feeling that she's trapped. A lot of the general social anxiety of it actually reminded me of when I started university almost a decade ago, fuck that makes me feel very old, where I was hit by this aggressive culture shock where, despite feeling like this was my destiny, my calling, my purpose in life, something just clicked and that path was no more. I spiraled into disillusionment. Maybe this passion of pursuing filmmaking I had since I was a kid wasn't for me, because suddenly I was surrounded by people with identical feelings and aspirations, and what I felt was special to me turned out to be untrue. I was hit with a reality check and became very disconnected from other people until I figured things out. The thing is, in the worst conditions, when your creativity becomes institutionalized, you begin to feel more like a number following strict rules, and in the case of Susie, she experiences increasingly oppressive conditions that are masked by the illusion of freedom she once had. Thankfully, I never had to live in dorms, but when Susie is forced to stay there after being kicked out of her friend's apartment due to interference from the academy, I felt the same sentiments my friends shared when they lived in dorms. You're so out of your comfort zone that it's excruciatingly difficult to relax, and at worst, you feel uncontrollably homesick. Susie even complains to her dorm mate Sarah that living in the academy makes her feel like a 10-year-old trapped under a watchful eye, which is later reinforced by a literal quarantine after a maggot infestation happens in the dorms, isolating the dancers together while the evil that haunts the academy lays right behind them.
Are you sleeping here with us too, Madame Black?
Certainly, as are all the other teachers and Miss Tanner.
Their sense of freedom is slowly being taken away, made more evident when Susie is forced into a restrictive diet by the academy after she has a hemorrhage in class. Now, to go any further, I will need to address the main threat, but in fairness, it's not the most demanding of spoilers. As I said, Suspiria isn't really much for plot, but you've been warned anyway. Essentially, the exposition scene can be summarized as the story of a witch called Helena Marcos, known as the Black Queen, who was exiled from several countries before founding a school that covertly performed occultic rituals to drain power to keep her alive in order to ensure the continued power and strength of the other witches in her coven. Yet the one interesting detail is when the psychiatrist explaining the witches to Susie believes that the strength of their power comes from mental illness. In other words, the mind makes it so. Or at least that's what I think he suggests, because it doesn't elaborate any further on the connection between the two. Instead, he brings forward another professor who wrote a book on the relationship between paranoia and magic, implying that the best way to overcome the alluring spell Susie seems to be under is through skepticism. Maybe I'm overthinking it or completely misreading it, but I got the impression that both of them are basically trying to say that the witches can only truly show their power to those who believe or can be easily made susceptible to such superstition. Interestingly, this exposition does help to further justify the film's highly talked about visual style as a method of cerebral storytelling. In a 2017 British Film Institute article celebrating Suspiria's 40th anniversary, it highlighted Dario Argento's fascination in both fairy tales and German Expressionism as the core inspirations for the cinematography, production design, and performance of the actors, with Argento describing Expressionism's dreams, provocations, unreality, and psychoanalysis as crucial to his method of storytelling. In fact, the BFI made the same comparison I'm about to make regarding Suspiria possibly being most influenced by Robert Wiene's 1920 The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. At the heart of Dr. Caligari's narrative was a powerful psychological horror that, major spoilers for an over 100-year-old film, had a plot twist where the hero of the story, Francis, is revealed to be a patient in a mental institution whose story is fabricated through other patients and doctors, such as the institution's director, who is ultimately the titular Dr. Caligari. Caligari was one of the earliest horror films famous almost exclusively for its stylization, but the problem is that the simplicity of its legacy sometimes overshadowed how paramount style was, more so as an explicit method of subtext and storytelling. As film historians Kristin, THOMPSON, and David BORDWELL perfectly described, its heavily distorted mise-en-scene and unrealistic dance-like acting was a function or a living element for the psyche of the characters. It was designed not only to be scary and surreal, but suck you into a troubled, morbid, and broken view of the world through the eyes of someone morally and psychologically different from you. THOMPSON and BORDWELL even consolidated this early method using a quote from actor Conrad Veidt, who played the film's slave killer somnambulist Caesar, which said, "If the decor has been conceived as having the same spiritual state as that which governs the character's mentality, the actor will find in that decor a valuable aid in composing and living his part." The point of it wasn't style over substance, as many people reductively assume, as if to suggest there's a way to actually quantify how deep or meaningful a story is. The point was, what makes it deep or meaningful is what we, as the audience, as individuals, choose to put into it. The Freudian quote that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar doesn't mean it can't emotionally resonate with each of us in different ways. We feel based on what we see and how we choose to see it. That's ultimately what Suspiria is. We're watching the world through someone else's eyes and witnessing untold horrors that none of us wish to ever experience. It's not just about traditionally telling us a story, it's more so about both exciting and terrifying us in equal measure, because none of us enjoy horror because we want to feel bad or depressed or make our lives miserable. We simply want an adrenaline rush delivered in a comfortable, leisurely manner before we go back into our boring, stressful lives that float by without even as much as a single note of Goblin's kick-ass musical score. Okay, so I'm not done yet, because originally my plan for this video was to compare and contrast Argento's version against Luca Guadagnino's 2018 remake, in the same way I did The Crazies, House on Haunted Hill, House of Wax, and so on. However, I got to a point writing about the 2018 remake where I just didn't feel any passion or enthusiasm to dig deep into it. And while that sounds like a cop-out and disappointing for those who greatly prefer the remake, I think my exhaustion speaks volumes for how my feelings for film have changed and softened over the years, in the same way I talked about Rob Zombie's Halloween remake. I'm not afraid to admit that I just didn't really get it. Yeah, the plot is easy to follow if you pay attention, but in terms of themes, subtext, metaphors, and the general historical context of the remake, if you had asked me to review this 5 years ago, I would be all over this like a fly on shit. But frankly and honestly, I just don't have that energy in my life anymore, and for a remake like this, it can only be truly done justice with a proper, carefully researched thesis. The thing is, the remake is a beast in terms of content. It is a 2.5-hour philosophical meditation that extends into socio-political issues. It doesn't rely on the mystery of the dance academy being a coven of witches. It literally gives you the exposition right in the opening, and instead focuses on this profoundly complex, multi-layered character study that goes as far as to make the exposition-dumping psychiatrist a fully realized central character living with the trauma of the Holocaust. This is what I mean when I say you need a proper thesis to really engage with the finer details, because the supernatural stuff is just the tip off the iceberg, and to focus solely on that undermines the breadth of issues at the heart of it. David Kagenich's screenplay takes a very sensitive and thoughtful approach to not only things like post-war trauma, but the ensuing chaos that still bleeds into the social and political climate of today. The remake is set in the same year as the original's release, so that it can symbolically mirror the story's events with the 1977 German Autumn, which saw the West German far-left militant group Red Army faction assassinate a former SS officer turned industrial president, while the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine hijacked a plane to rescue RAF prisoners, along with many other events that, as you can imagine, got incredibly fucking messy. This is why Suspiria's remake can't really be explained without some sort of academic approach, and the best I will give you to understand its artistic intentions is looking towards the remake's main influence, after screenwriter David Kaganich admitted in an interview with the LA Times that he wasn't a fan of the original. In Kagenich's words, which for the record, this is the guy who developed The Terror, so that helps explain the mix of supernatural and historical, the point of the remake was to explore how Susie's education in the academy mirrored fascism, and specifically, it addresses a generation of students and young people who were sick in their souls about how much denial there was in their parents' and grandparents' generations about German culpability in World War II. Yeah, it is a lot to take in, but Kaganich said he was inspired by the work of Rainer Werner Fassbinder, who was actually the most prolific left-wing filmmaker in the new German cinema era, which, to put it simply, dealt with that core issue. I'm going to pull out the THOMPSON and BORDWELL book for this one again. New German cinema was kind of in the same ballpark as Italian neorealism. They were films that dealt with post-war stigma and reconstruction, poverty, marginalization, racism, xenophobia, etc., etc. For example, a new German film I saw many years ago when I studied this topic is Fassbinder's Ali, Fear Eats the Soul, which explored racial tensions and poverty through a 60-year-old German cleaner and her loving relationship with a Moroccan migrant worker, set in the backdrop of the Munich massacre during the 1972 Summer Olympics. Again, that's a lot to take in, but the general idea was that it was this intimate singular story that humanized grander and urgent issues happening all around us, which we still see in many contemporary films like the kitchen sink British realism of Ken Loach or the marginalized America of Sean Baker. In fact, it's probably politically closer to post-war Russian cinema, which, as THOMPSON and BORDWELL describe, led to this divide between old filmmakers maintaining traditionalism, while the younger generation of filmmakers were encouraged to emphasize de-Stalinization. It's pretty much the polar opposite approach to German Expressionism, but I love that stylistic parallel of Argento going for fantasy and Expressionism, while Guadagnino goes for a cold, colorless, quasi-realistic look, which is further compounded by swapping out Goblin's hyper-energetic score for Radiohead's Thom Yorke and his depressing but soulful vocal cords. Don't get me wrong, the remake is still weird as fuck. Hell, arguably it's even more bizarre, to the point I can't actually show you anything from the climax because literally every inch of the frame is against YouTube's community guidelines. Although I have to at least mention this one scene where Susie does this aggressive dance that contorts the body of another student, and it is one of the most utterly disturbing pieces of body horror I have ever witnessed. I mean, after it's over, the girl doesn't even die. The witches stab her with hooks and drag her away and keep her alive for the climactic ritual. Anyway, I think regardless of specifics, I feel like I've given you a fair grasp of how this remake truly differs, besides one or two significant plot twists that I'm not going to spoil because I think there's no justice in just telling you what happens. Simply put, the remake is a proper period piece that I think you'll appreciate more if you read up on the historical context, which was exactly what happened to me when I saw The Green Knight recently. That was a movie that went right over my head until I read up on it, and now I understand what each scenario was meant to represent. At the same time, like with the 1977 original, it's not going to be for everyone, and echoing words from Martin Thomas from Double Toasted in his Alien Covenant review, it's not exactly helpful when a film requires you to do homework. So before you go, please leave your thoughts on Suspiria in the comments below, and until next time, stay safe, stay away from evil dance academies, and I'll see you all very soon.